Thank you, David. And on that reflection, I'm going to open for questions and comments. I'm going to start in the room and then move to our online audience. So I'm going to take them in groups of 3. And if you could please state your name and organisation, and obviously keep your questions and comments as brief as possible so we can get as many perspectives as possible. So first 3 from the room. I'll start over that side. So 2 gentlemen at the front and then the lady here. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's John Gibb, and I used to work in development. I'm retired now. So just 2, first of all, thank you very much. Very interesting, and you've got a really good array of people here today. I actually started out as an urban geographer many years ago. First of all, just a comment about community, because one of the last jobs I did was a lot on polio eradication and working on neglected tropical diseases. And there was a big emphasis on the role of the community. But when you talk about this, are you talking about dereliction of duty by government and substituting for government on a community who are already very, very heavily pressed? So it's okay, it might be all right as a halfway house, but it certainly shouldn't be a substitute for the responsibilities of the state. The second thing I would say is there seems to be an awful lot of talk, and I'm afraid it sounds like reinventing the wheel. There are existing models all over the world of urban systems and urban processes, which we have to copy. I don't think we have to do an awful lot more research. It's all been done before. Go back to, I don't know, 18th century London or something like this, and the putting in of water and sanitation and John Snow and all that sort of thing. But my question is, out of all this work, who's costing it, and who's going to pay for it, and who's going to raise the money? To me, clean water and sanitation is probably the most fundamental thing that the world needs today, but I don't really see much progress happening. Thanks.
Thank you. I think there was actually we'll take the gentleman and then the lady at the back, and then I'll come back to this side of the room if that's okay.
Thank you. I'm Hugh Wendman-Smith. A long time ago, I was an ODI fellow in Zambia. I'm now an independent researcher with an interest in urbanisation. The point I'd like to pick up is, in the background papers, a persistent theme is the weakness of urban administrations, particularly the smaller ones. I know Africa better than other parts of the world. There may be better examples in Latin America. But does the panel, or does anyone, have a prescription for how to strengthen urban administrations in smaller towns, for example in Africa, that can be more generally applied, because at the moment they're all very weak? And related to that, what is the right division of labour between urban administrations whose capacity is bound to be limited and the community-type organisations we've been hearing about, whose work sounds rather inspiring but often cannot be productive without some kind of government structure that it can relate to? Thank you.
Thank you. And the lady at the back.
Thank you. So I'm Yamisi Bokini. I'm a doctor by training, working on public health in urban African cities. My question, just out of curiosity, actually, I think Mark mentioned something about the differences between the visions of the technocrats and the political classes are growing further apart in terms of what the city should look like. I'd just like to know, like, what are the core points of tension, and why are the visions sort of pulling further apart?
Thank you. Mark, do you want to start on that one? And I was also going to bring to you the question, which I know you didn't phrase an explicit question, but has all the research really been done before? Urban Arc seems best placed to answer that.
Thanks. Yeah. So on vision, particularly just in our project, but I guess it would be interesting to look more broadly. We worked in New York, London, Lagos, Kolkata, and Tokyo. And in all of those cities, there was a tension between development vision. So we asked people to describe the core trajectory of development as they saw it, whatever that might mean to them. And then we went through in quite detail what adaptation and maladaptation might look under different aspects of development. So the development tension, very, very broadly across those cities, seemed to be between a more public, collective vision of development and a more private, individualized version of development, including London. So here it was very much about the role of the state, welfare state, and an emergent sort of private sector approach to risk management, as we've seen very recently, with the fire event in London as an outcome of the privatisation of the management, and also a reduced capacity and the ability of emergency services to respond. Not the immediate event, but in the aftermath in terms of people's accommodation and so on. In placing where so decision makers would suggest that they were, say, in London, broadly to the privatised side of that continua, but wanting to be slightly more on the welfare state side of that continua. But recognising then that the trajectory of change driven by policymakers was much more towards the privatised side. So there was first of all, a desire to move the relationship between risk management and development, in the case of London, but in different flavours replicated across all the cities, towards the public sector. But that of itself was a challenge, but recognising the overall movement in development was actually in the opposite direction, more towards private responsibility. So not to say that one was overwhelmingly better or worse, but there was certainly this growing difference in the visions of the technical classes. So we worked with local authorities and city municipal actors across all these cities, and the more political class. So sorry, I know that was a bit of a detailed answer. And in terms of science, well, it's a question we constantly ask ourselves, I think. And I think there'd be at least two ways where I feel the science has contributed, at least in urban arc. One is that data is power, and I think, as SDI has shown really strongly. And so collaborating, it doesn't have to be science universities that generate data and present that to those in positions of power, but certainly data is power. With that comes knowledge and understanding. Cities, of course, are constantly evolving, and yes, it will be the same sorts of dynamics. It will be expressions of poverty, it'll be environmental change, it'll be technological change, changes in governance. But we do need to keep track of the relationships, I would say, between those different elements. And then a space where science is perhaps less positioned, and there's a good deal of learning from our side to do, is the role of science as a language that can convene relationships. So it can be a neutral space, it can be a language that can bring the richer and the poorer, the formal and the informal together. And we've seen this in Nairobi, and there are some colleagues in the room that can talk to it more than myself. But by working with informal settlements, enabling self-assessment of risk, there is a language there of science, of monitoring flood, of monitoring vulnerability, that can be brought into conversations with large corporate development, mall development and the like, that wasn't there before. So the mall development that might change water courses, lead to flood risk, all other sorts of implications. In the past, there may have been some cursory consultation. Now that same process might unfold, but those being affected have a new language with which to speak, and a language that brings a bit more voice to their underlying values. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. And Skye and Megan, Skye, I'll take you first. I just wondered if you could answer this point. Are we pushing down responsibilities to communities? And should we be investing in building up local government capacity? And if so, how? And also, Megan, I don't know if you have any comment on, well, what are the costs and who's going to pay? And obviously, there's also a normative question there about, well who should pay? Skye, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. I think, yes, I'd like to pick up on that question and also relate it to the second question. So the idea that the work of these communities is a substitute for the state, that's something we really work to ensure that's not the aim at all, that in fact the state becomes more accountable to and invests more in combating inequality and exclusion in cities. So, for instance, with something like a community upgrading fund, there'll be a contribution from the state. Sometimes in under-resourced states, we have even begun from a point where the state or the city was asked to give land for the upgrading projects, and then donor contribution for the infrastructure, and a community contribution of their savings to the project as well. So we're trying to blend everybody's contribution and to influence through these sort of precedent-setting projects, decisions that are made moving forward about service provision, land tenure, and housing in informal settlements. So an example, and especially that's coming up quite a lot in the climate change adaptation and resilience work at the moment, is around eviction. So we've got a lot of cities that think that, okay, we need to clear this wetland, or we need to get people out of the flood zone on the coast, or we need to move people from sensitive infrastructure. So if there's no dialogue there, if there's no sense that communities should have a voice in the planning of their city, the bulldozer is normally the first option to get those people out of that area. We've seen horrific sort of evictions in Lagos of late for these reasons, and the point of the organizing, and there was a victory actually the day before yesterday in Lagos, where because of this pressure from community and because of the international pressure that the network is able to bring to bear, a decision is then taken by in this case, the governor's office, that resettlement, a negotiated resettlement is required, and forced evictions will not be tolerated. So our starting point is to make states take on more responsibility and be more responsive to the needs of their majority population, which often is in informal settlements, but also that the people in informal settlements also take up their responsibilities and have a stake in the conversation. So for the second person who asked a question was talking about how to make these productive, and it's really important that we don't just have sort of ceremonial participatory development spaces. And I think Megan's point is sometimes communities and local governments are very sort of tired of new frameworks and new ideas and concepts that have to be reflected upon in workshops, but sometimes it's just if the ongoing dialogue is there. It doesn't matter whether the label is resilience or climate change or poverty reduction. There's much more action that is likely. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy. Megan, I don't know if you'd like to comment quickly. I know David would like to say something about the costs after you. So.
Sure. I mean, with regards to who's costing it, we know that various organisations have done so, and even put out amounts of how much dealing with some of these challenges is going to cost. Who's going to pay for it? I think there's no one source. I think it needs to come from multiple avenues. But for us, the ultimate representation of something having been brought into by a city and having the value seen by a city is when eventually the city, by its own mechanisms, funds a particular project or program. And we have seen some successful examples where an external funder, say Danida or CEDA or one of these big development agencies, funds a pilot project in an African city over a period of time. We work intensely with that city in understanding what the benefits are, both socio-economic, both present and future, both from an environmental perspective too, and then seeing the city eventually funding it using its own existing municipal budget or more innovative funding mechanisms. And I think for us, we need to be looking at various funding options, but when an African city is able to use funding that it has access to or innovative funding mechanisms to really embed a particular project or program, that's the ultimate, for me, that's the ultimate way in which we can see sustainability into the future.
Thank you, Megan. David, you wanted to comment on the costs and payments issue?
Well, the thing that astonishes me is people have been saying that water and sanitation is important, but the funding hasn't gone there. 1976, the UN Conference, Human Settlements. We commit to guarantee that everyone gets good water and sanitation by 1990, or as soon after as possible. 1977, a special conference in Chile, committed to universal provision for water and sanitation. The 1980s, the International Drinking Water and Sanitation Decade. And a lot of blah, blah, blah. If you look at the amount of money that goes to big water and sanitation in cities, it's tiny. And what I don't get is that many of the bilateral agencies have difficulty spending their capital. And yet here is a large capital investment with phenomenal health returns that delivers over 50 to 100 years. I don't get it. In Latin America, what you've seen is that strong democracy, mayors elected for the first time, have produced all sorts of solutions to water and sanitation, almost universal provision. But then, of course, the municipal budgets are 50 to 100 times more per person than most sub-Saharan African nations. So it's the international agencies have got to commit to water and sanitation. And it's not in these little tiny projects. You go to most informal settlements now, and there's a two-seater toilet here funded by 3 international agencies, and another 3-seater toilet there. And you need citywide systems for water, and you need citywide systems for sewers and for drains and for excreta removal. Just my final whinge, it's a wonderful chance to have a good whinge. Huge sums are being proposed for climate funds, the Global Climate Fund, for instance. Now, will they see a good piped water, sewer, drain, solid waste collection and management system as absolutely critical for climate change adaptation and fund it, or will they see that's development and they're not going to touch it? I'm very worried that it's going to be the latter.
Thank you, David. We're going to move to online questions. Matafu, I have a couple for you to start off with. This is from Amiera Saras, who's at the Swedish International Peace Research Institute in Stockholm. And she would like to ask you a bit more about the role of informal actors in filling public service gaps. Is it possible to fill these gaps through the actions of informal actors? And are there security issues as a result of informal versus formal governance? So do you want to take those questions, Matafu, and then I'll put out some of the online questions for the wider speakers.
Thank you very much. What is regarded as informal is only in relation to the government systems. But as soon as the government recognizes that these are the people living in this city, they no longer become informal. So that's my simple answer to that question. It's a question of the government recognizing that these people who are regarded as informal are part of the city. As soon as we just recognize that they are part of the city, the informality ends there. The next stage is to work together to improve the systems. That's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Matafu. And I've got 3 broader questions for the whole team. One is about investment and the private sector. So from Catherine Allison at Future Earth Limited, what new tools and structures are needed for communities to be able to provide robust bottom line evidence on how improved resilience positively affects the urban triple bottom line? So what kind of new tools and structures will serve to attract inward investment at the scale required? And a question from Kate Armstrong at McKinsey & Company. What do you see as the role for the private sector in building these types of urban resilience in sub-Saharan Africa? So perhaps Sky, Megan, David, Mark, maybe a quick comment if you'd like on those issues. Do you want to start, Megan?
Yeah, I mean, maybe on the private sector, please be trying to work more and more with the private sector in the realm of sustainability. And I have to say, our experience has been that it is a challenge in some respects to bring the public sector's worldviews and the public sector's agendas closer together with the private sector and what motivates them. One example of how we try to bring them closer together, as an example, is we host a resilience conference every year in Bonn, and we've had this last one in May this year, an entire stream of the conference running with some of the top insurers and reinsurers coming to speak to us around what motivates both what they invest in, but also what motivates how they insure cities and what they insure and how they can ensure more resilient infrastructure. And what became very apparent was very different languages being spoken and the difficulty in the city practitioners understanding the private sector individuals and the other way around. And so I think a lot of work there needs to be done on both sides to better understand the motivations and how the private sector functions in comparison to a public sector with regard to public good and what motivates private sector investments for us to see that collaboration happen more effectively. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done to get the private sector and the public sector to work more effectively to create more resilient cities. but I think it's a growing area and one that will more and more become important.
Thanks, Megan. Sky, do you maybe want to address this question about what data really as well that communities can provide that will serve to attract inward investment at the scale required? What new tools and structures are needed?
Yeah, I think this is definitely an area that SDI recognizes it needs to place more attention in understanding. We are being encouraged to think of the private sector not just as a source of funding for a project, but to definitely become more of a partner in shaping how investments are made. So through the data collection that we do at city scale, we understand that there are going to be possibilities to sort of de-risk investment in informal settlements by really understanding the situation, but also having an organized community that's part of the investment decision making and even management. So these are areas that we are really committed to understanding better, to forging partnerships that can make use of some of the innovations around markets for good and innovative finance. And I think for sure it's something that we don't understand fully, but are fully committed to working on with increased intensity in the coming year.
Thanks, Guy. I'm going to move to a final block of questions, kind of starting on this side of the room. Two ladies here, and did I see a hand up around there? If not, we'll go back over that side as well, and a gentleman at the back.
Hi, I'm Laurie Gehring from the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I'm curious about this thing that Megan was talking about how you can take a pilot project and then embed that works. I'd be really curious to hear some examples that she has or others have where that's actually worked, where something's come from outside and then been taken on board and owned.
Hi, it's Linda Bear. I work for International Development Research Centre in Canada, and I'm doing my DPhil in urban resilience at Oxford. Thank you. I think it's been great to hear, and thank you, David, for your comments about resilience. I think it does open up some cool spaces, but it is not well understood. So it's sad to see those spaces lost. Some of the words, and it comes from more of an operational background. So I've worked with UNICEF for years in sort of violent responses, and then up in Nepal in sort of just before the earthquake was happening, assessing some of the DRR. A few words I haven't heard too much yet is the issues around violence. So if you asked a mayor what are their big issues, and sometimes they're grappling with some of the non-infrastructure issues that and how to address them, gang rape in some of the slum areas, and I guess migration would be the other big word that I'd say is how to, with the refugee flows that are going on, how do cities where they're not even having a clear mandate but yet having the presence of people that are there, deal with them in a more positive way, I guess you could say. I'm glad, Mark, that you brought up the issue around the fire here, because the secondary response was a key thing. And I would probably say one from more of being operational in some of the emergency responses, what I've seen as a gap, and maybe it'd be good to get your comments on, is that there's not maybe the appreciation for the role of different parts of the response. So sometimes you'll get the governance piece, which is on the weak side, what you were saying. But the civil society piece is maybe disjointed or there to some, and the strength of that is really good when it's there. But sometimes the humanitarian response that comes in, it's funny that they're not always speaking to each other. And I think that was very, very stark in Nepal, is seeing, really well-developed DRR at sort of an operational level, but when the government actually can't respond sometimes either in violence or if they're also affected by the catastrophe, is, where is that sort of the connection between some of those responses? Just a final one about where you're seeing the role of decentralization. in a positive way. Megan, maybe that goes to you, is where you've seen some good examples of decentralized planning around DRR in resilience. Thanks.
Thanks. A lot of questions embedded in there, but just to the gentleman at the back, finally.
Good afternoon. My name is Chidi Wonu from the Defence Cultural Specialist Unit. My first question has actually just been asked by the lady from there, or at least in and around that. So I'll rephrase it whilst I give my second question, which is related to the tension which has been alluded to between the political and the technocratic. My experience of African political leaders at all levels, but particularly at the lower levels, is that leadership is purely a patronage network. And using and political power, as a mayor or whatever it is, you use that to fill departments with your followers, political associates, etc. So my query is, rather than a lot of these plans are really great, but they're not going to happen simply because there's no benefit to a politician implementing all these things when he's trying to feed his patronage network. So wouldn't a better approach, or has there been any approach that looks more at strengthening democracy and accountability as an incentive to these political actors to at least sustain or at least reinforce, or at best leave the technocrats alone to do what they're doing, rather than looking for funds and pumping more money into them so that they can steal it, as it were? But on the next question, which related to the drift towards urbanization, particularly in Africa, most of it's been economic, and it's been poorly managed. Again, in my experience, it's been very poorly managed. No infrastructure has been put in place. And then now there's a new dynamic of migration through either climate or conflict. So I'm thinking of Maiduguri in northern Nigeria, Eastleigh in Nairobi. So the question I've got is that this changes not only the cultural dynamic of those areas, as in it can displace certain ethnic groups or make certain ethnic groups stronger, and also it changes the planning nature, as in you've now got unplanned structures that you've put in place. How exactly can you model this, and how exactly can you plan for this in the context of where you're looking at in terms of resilience, and then balancing the risks or developing resilience, in that maybe you don't want those populations to be permanent, but you still have to cater for them? Thank you.
Thank you. A lot of embedded questions. Perhaps if we go through the speakers and you pick up on some of the points that it feels kind of most appropriate to answer. David, should we start with you?
One of the things I've tried to do over the last 30 years is to spend time in informal settlements and to watch and to listen. And very often it's in response to a particular initiative. The women's savings groups in India were horrified by the level of crime in their informal settlement, and the police never came in. So they formed their own committee, 7 women, 3 men, and they provided the policing themselves. But they negotiated with the police so that the police provided them with 2 officers that were permanently in the settlement, who were known to the whole community, so they were accountable to them. And what you've seen is these police panchayats very successfully reducing crime and violence and risk. Now, there's a bigger story to be told, because you go in to look at the police panchayats and then you hear all the other ways that community organisations, especially women-led community organisations based around savings groups, are doing lots of things, making sure that people get access to the community toilets without risk to themselves. They were in the settlement I was at recently. They were closing down the illegal alcohol stills because this was such an important part of drunkenness and violence against women. But by being very pragmatic, they not only closed down the illegal dens, they gave the proprietors a loan to develop an alternative livelihood away from alcoholism. It's also through communities that we go to scale. We get the question about going to scale. There's been lots of pilot projects that have gone to scale. There was a pilot project in 1992 in Mumbai to see whether communities could design, build and manage toilets. And they could. 1.5 million people in Mumbai now use toilets designed, built and managed by community organizations. In Nairobi, in Kenya, the Muungano, the Homeless People's Federation of Kenya, have built 7,000 houses with a small loan fund managed by a local fund. The Community Organizations Development Institute in Thailand started with a small support program to women's savings groups, and there's 500,000 people have benefited from their loans to build new homes, to secure tenure in their settlement, and to get in infrastructure. The Ukarangi Pilot Project started as a pilot project. 2 million people in urban areas in Karachi now benefit from some of the best quality sewers and storm drains in Asia, all done by the community. But in all these instances, the community is always looking to government to help. You can do the small pipes as a community. You can put in all the pipes that take away the sewage or bring in the water for your community. You can't do the big stuff. So they negotiated with government to do the big pipes. So again, you've got this community local government dynamic, which is what gives you the chance to go to scale and to really go to scale. And we've got enough examples to know this isn't just one or two initiatives.
Thank you, David. Megan, I don't know if you could also comment on positive examples of decentralisation where this has empowered local governments to be able to take appropriate responses.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to comment a little bit more on the pilot project aspect. I mean, I think that the key thing is that it shouldn't be seen as external actors coming into a city and imposing solutions or imposing a project. It's only effective and it only goes from being a pilot project to rolled out and upscaled when it's co-produced, when it's city stakeholders saying what they need and organizations and donors working with them to achieve that. Will that pilot project likely then be funded by the municipality going forward? A nice, easy example from eThekwini Municipality, Durban, is the Buffalo's Drive Community Reforestation Project, which the city now part funds. So I think the key thing around upscaling and outscaling and funders is about attitude. And the funders that we work with, where we find the most success, are those that are and external agents, those that are humble, that recognize that African city stakeholders know their cities best, and we should be listening to them more than imposing solutions on them. And also a flexibility in how funding is dispersed and how work plans are calculated, etc., because of the dynamic and resource constraints and environments in African cities. So, that in a sense is a form of decentralization, is when the solutions are not top down, they're bottom up, and that sounds cliche, but they only work when they're responding specifically to city needs and community needs.
Thanks, Megan. And maybe Sky Matafu, Mark, as well, just to comment a little bit on these questions bubbling up about politics, patronages networks, how to build accountability and its role in promoting resilience. Do you want to start, Matafu, comment from Malawi?
Yeah, just to comment, in relation to the other questions, there was a big question on prescribing. Someone said, can we prescribe something? Some solution. I think it's very difficult to prescribe, because cities are very complex and there's a lot of transformation. So the solution should not be to prescribe, but just some tools, some suggestions which can work one time, and then next time you have another suggestion which could help to solve a specific problem. So we should not be looking at prescriptions, but something that will work for a specific time, for a specific city, a specific community. I think that is how we should be looking at it. In doing that, we could be solving the challenges related to funding, the challenges related to decentralization, and all those things, especially if we involve the community in finding solutions, but also in implementing projects, however small they may be, construction of toilets, maybe of bigger projects as well. They should be part of the process of doing that, of finding the solutions. Because if we neglect them, we are in fact overburdening ourselves. So I wanted to say earlier that if we do something with the community, we should also look at it as part of the funding, because they're taking a role which the government or the city should have themselves financed. But that task is done by the community. So in other words, they are subsidizing the city. The communities are subsidizing the city, because It's the mayor and his councillors who have the responsibility to provide services. So here we see the communities coming forward that we can do certain things for ourselves. And these are things for which these people are employed. And these are the things the mayor and his friends are paid for. But the community is saying we will do it ourselves. So we should instead thank them for doing that. I thank you.
Thank you, Matafu. Sky, I don't know whether you want to comment further on the question of kind of informal political relationships and how we move to more accountable and democratic relationships between civil society and state.
Sure. I think that for SDI, this process starts in the savings groups, and I think the comment about visioning by Mark earlier, this is sort of where it starts. You're starting to build systems of accountability. You're starting to build systems of finance management. You're starting to build systems of horizontal decision-making and accountability that you test out in that savings group and then later in your network and in your city-level federation. As city-level federations then become very savvy players in the development space, and they're very well adapted to understand the role of a politician versus the role of a technical professional. They can understand what is needed from the politician to get the buy-in and to get the sort of the right statements to support the upgrading or the whatever initiative they're pushing. But then they also most certainly need the technocrats to be the ones to continue the work and make sure that these political sort of statements are followed through. I think the micro projects that they do also prepare them to hold government accountable for the projects and the budgets that they have. We see communities also then feeling like they have a right to ask questions, to monitor budgets, to visit municipal councils where that really truly maybe 10 years ago in many of the cities where we work wasn't the case. And now there's a more constant dialogue, there are more demands for accountability, there's more of a sense in the community and in the councils, oftentimes that this is just a standard part of practice. So I think these are sort of incremental changes, but this falls within the process of movement building as far as SDI is concerned.
Thank you, Sky. We need to move to wrap up, but I'm aware there was an outstanding question in the room and online. So what I'd like to do is take those questions and then go back along our speakers, starting with Mark, and maybe you can wrap some thoughts into those final reflections from the questions. So I think there was a question from the lady here.
It wasn't a question. I just wanted to add to some of the comments on, the costing and the funding from corporate organization. In connection with Rekib Ben Kaiser, Save the Children, we ran a program in Nigeria on Stop the Diarrhea program. And so we were working with the communities, with different stakeholders, government, and the universities, the different levels of the government to try to eradicate, sort of diarrhea as an underlying cause of child mortality. So we're looking at water, we're looking at sanitation, we're looking at all the different aspects of it. So this was funding coming in from Rekib by side, partnering, with the government of Nigeria, with the local government, with the people, and trying to build. In the process, we were building resilience. We were looking at community water supplies. We were looking at, community-led total sanitation. And we were reviving government structures in order to be. And the whole idea is that you do it's a pilot program that the government says that if it works and it's working, that they will then model and then roll it out as a big signature program. And so, but we haven't gotten to the end yet, but we are in the process. But this is just like, when you're talking of costing and corporate partnership. So this is a partnership between the corporate world, between an international NGO, and also with the people. But so that's just my comment on corporate funding. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's a question online from Sam Barnard, who used to be a researcher here at ODI. He's now in the Department of Urban Planning at MIT, who says, are our current suite of development finance institutions, with their need to engage almost exclusively through national governments, really fit for purpose in addressing city-level challenges? Or do we need new global and regional institutions which are set up to deal with local governments directly? So, no small task to answer all of that. But Mark, do you want to start with some kind of wrap-up thoughts and any responses to those comments and questions?
Thanks. So the last comment was well made, I think, around the need for direct funding, subnational. If that can be cracked, we'll move quickly. Just maybe one quick reflection then, wrapping up lots of the points and reflecting on science. And science, of course, is also an actor with power in cities that we need to consider as a researcher and otherwise. And certainly the lessons we've learned around urban arc are the need to act with humility, but also to balance that humility with the sort of structural, another kind of structural view that science can bring. And one quick example of that is a collaboration in Nairobi with the Kunke Design Initiative working in Kibera. And they have 9 community groups. Actually, it's the example I referred to before, where they're able to hold to account corporate-style development. And each of those groups initially work with to enhance their awareness of flood risk, and International Alert, who's in the room, also work with them to think through conflict, local conflict, and the role that that plays in mapping out vulnerability. But then an added layer with science and climate downscaling, seeing these settlements within Kibera at a different scale, connecting them to the watershed, suddenly requires a networked approach to deal with larger scale problems that individually the households and community groups weren't able to see. So kind of negotiating within ourselves and with partners the appropriate balance between humility and bringing a wider, perhaps different scale approach to systemic problems is one of the challenges. And the second one I just quickly put out there is working in collaboration, again, in urban art with the Homeless People's Federation in Makuru, and they're accepting that science perhaps follows capacity building. So rather than trying to bring learnings from, in fact, some of Mtafu's work to the city, the first step is to work with the Homeless People's Federation, and in fact to allow them to have full control over doing what they do, which is building community groups that then Mtafu can interact with to generate risk reduction as part of the community building effort. So science following on an established network of capacity building rather than sort of jumping in there and running around and trying to convert everyone to a DRR viewpoint. So again, a very sort of delicate negotiation.
Thank you, Mark. Matafu, would you like to follow?
Just one point which I think is central, that we didn't need to start from somewhere when we go into the communities. Because my experience is that even the government itself, they always claim that the communities have no capacity. But when you go to the government, they don't have capacity either. So we have to start from somewhere, working with the community as well as going into the government. So as someone coming in from maybe the university, you are almost taking on the role of mayor yourself. Because if you go to the community, you find that the structures which exist in the policies, they are not there on the ground. So, for example, in Malawi, we have the National Disaster Risk Management Policy, well laid out structures in the policy. But when you go there, you have your proposal, you say, no, I will work with these structures. You go, they're not there. So you have to set up these structures on behalf of the government yourself. So to me, that shows that even the government doesn't have the capacity themselves. So it's only at that point that you would start now to do the small things that the community would benefit, because you are now bringing awareness. Even though you are coming in for your research, you first of all also have to give awareness to the people that, do you know, the policy says you are supposed to have a community committee in this area, and here it is written, but you don't have it. So that from there, then you start doing the rest of the work. I thank you.
Thank you, Matafu. Megan, would you like to follow?
Yeah, I think my only last question would just be around, for me, this growing feeling that there almost needs to be principles of engagement, of how you engage with cities and communities. And I think we all really have a responsibility to dumb down the complexity talk and using terms like wicked problems, etc., to make playing within the realm of all of these different global agreements and local challenges manageable to city stakeholders and community members. And I think part of that is about understanding what are the priorities of whoever you're engaging with, whoever that stakeholder is, and then tailoring those messages in a way that they're able to take those up and come up with solutions in a more positive light. So for me, it's around those principles of engagement and some of those attitudinal issues that I think are important, but also about in trying to make complexity not feel completely overwhelming to the vulnerable communities that we're really working to assist.
Thank you, Megan. Sky, would you like to come in before I can finish with David?
Sorry, I was being unmuted as you asked the question. I didn't hear you.
Would you like to provide us with a few final reflections, Sky?
Okay. Final reflection. I think I'm grateful for the opportunity. I think the panel was very well assembled, and I would be really eager to take forward the discussion with some of the members and anyone else who is part of the conference moving forward. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Sky. And David, can I ask you also just to address this final question of global regional institutions for funding city governments?
The most exciting thing that's happened to me in the last 10 years is to see the federations setting up their own funds. So that if you want to fund the Kenyan Homeless People's Federation, you've got a foundation that will provide you with absolute accountability and transparency, far more than any other funding agency. And this funding agency is to allow the federations to increase the scale and the scope of what they do, and to bring in city government. So, in a sense, the two critical places we need to invest, city government, grassroots organizations, you already have the financial mechanisms to double, triple, quadruple, multiply 10, 20-fold the funding. Now, why haven't the international funding agencies got the imagination to see this potential and to support it? And that's what I don't understand.
Thank you, David. Well, it's been a very rich and fascinating discussion. Thank you all for your contributions. It's been replete with examples and cases, and fascinating, I think, in particular in its reflections on the processes of building partnership in and around formal governance structures and with community movements in particular. For those of us in London, there is tea and coffee now outside in the lobby, which you'll find just out there. Please do stay to carry on the conversations and get to meet other people. And to you, those of you online, thank you very much for your contribution.